Okay, so Sesetu, first and foremost, thank you again for joining us. If you can just start us off by telling us a little about yourself and how you ended up working in the field of transitional justice.
Thank you, Anastasia. Hello to you and anyone that will listen to this interview. My name is Sesetu Holomisa, and I came into the transitional justice field through studying politics and law in my undergrad. And I was realizing slowly that law perhaps might not be the best field for me just because I was interested in human rights and social justice. And I know that you can practice as a human rights lawyer, but it felt like the constraints were very much more pronounced than I thought they were in terms of what I can achieve, what I can participate in. And Professor Helen Scanlon introduced me to transitional justice when I specialized in justice and transformation for my honors and later on my master's, and broadening what it looks like to advocate for, imagine, and pursue human rights for all, not just legally, but socially, economically, and what the different ways people have been working in the transitional justice field to achieve those rights, but particularly after mass human rights violations or conflict or transitions from abusive governments and so on.
Thank you. And then even a follow-up to that, what role do you think the youth has to play in the processes of transitional justice as a way of addressing those mass human rights violations?
I mean, I think both of us can agree that as South African youth, we're both the inheritors of trauma and the unfinished struggles of the past, but also the futures that we want to create. The responsibility lies with us. So I'd say that the youth has a massive role in transitional justice processes. And that's something that isn't being explored or utilized very well by practitioners who are usually more experienced and therefore a little bit older in age, using, of course, their institutional knowledge, which is invaluable, but also failing to bring in the people that will live what the results are or the consequences of their decisions and actions.
And so, if you could outline then, how is it that you came to work for the Foundation of Human Rights? What do they do? What is your role in the organization as well?
Okay, so I found the Foundation for Human Rights through Helen in my first year of master's. One of the representatives who's now my program manager, Kashia, was one of the participants in a transitional justice short course at UCT. I met her and found out about the unfinished business of the TRC, which is one of the 4 programs that the Foundation for Human Rights does. And just to take a step back, the Foundation for Human Rights is a South African NGO that works to advance human rights, strengthen constitutional democracy, and address the legacies of apartheid, hence the unfinished business of the TRC. And what we do in that program is families approach us and share that they know someone or are someone who suffered human rights violations or was forcibly disappeared. And in the case of those speaking on behalf of someone else, were killed by the security branch. And either they went to the TRC and nothing was done afterwards, or perpetrators filed for amnesty and that amnesty application was denied. And the case was sent to the National Prosecuting Authority, the NPA, post TRC, where the cases were meant to be investigated and then had the potential to be prosecuted, but that never happened. And so they come to us and search for truth about what happened to their loved ones, wanting to know where their remains are, who did what were the last moments of their loved ones like, if it was a suicide in detention. A lot of the families are aware that it was most probably a murder by the security branch officers and want that to be corrected in the historical narrative that their loved one didn't die by suicide but was killed by the apartheid regime. And so we work with a retired brigadier investigator, Mr. Clifford Marion, who does initial investigations for us, and then we connect with some of the major law firms in South Africa on a pro bono basis for the families. And then we, on the foundation side, continue with advocacy, letting the public know about the stories that may have been minimized in our collective historical narrative, and also assist with the reopening of inquests and the push for prosecutions where they're viable to be pursued, if that's what the family would like.
And then even like a follow up to that, would you say that, because we spoke about the youth earlier, would you say that intergenerational trauma would also play a role in these renewed pursuits for accountability and justice? Are you witnessing that in the work that you're doing with the families?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, there's so many children and grandchildren of apartheid activists who are continuing on with this fight and have seen what the loss of an individual, in some cases even more than one, did to the family, did to the community, and how it, even if they never knew these people because they were too young or hadn't been born yet, they've still inherited the traumas of what happened to their loved ones. And so I see it in most of the cases that we work with, that it doesn't end with the person who maybe passed away in 1978. It's carried by new generations who, one, their material conditions have been impacted by the loss of an individual. And it's easy to think of what life could have been like if their loved one was still around. And in other instances, you see it in the career paths that they choose. It's a means to connect to that person and that history, and to also, on another level, keep their memory alive in one shape or form. And that speaks, storytelling and memory and remembering. A lot of family members want the sacrifice that their families suffered to be noticed. Most cases on a national level, because the sacrifice was for the country, right? But now they're living alone with the negative repercussions of living without their loved ones who fought for our freedom and in many cases died for our freedom. And then also looking at what freedom really means in South Africa today, because a lot of people would argue that it's partial freedom. When you look at economic injustice, social injustice, spatial injustice, where people live, there's very much an awareness of the continuity of apartheid's legacy, and not just emotionally and psychologically, but also very materially.
And I agree with you on that. The different forms, there are also different forms of memory that comes to the surface when I look at the work of FHR and the work you're doing with the family members, especially the families. There's also a sense of an embodied memory at work as well. And I guess their pursuits come from a place of pain, from a place of grief, but also a sense of not knowing and being unwilling to accept what the state has told them, the narrative that it was by suicide. So I definitely think that's something we can also take into consideration. And just, I mean, that even links to, I think, our final point. What we've noticed about a week or so ago, it was reported that the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into the alleged attempts to obstruct the investigation and prosecution of Truth and Reconciliation Commission cases, they're actually inviting interested parties to attend a pre-hearing meeting in the coming weeks. So, in what ways do you think this engagement and the Judicial Commission will change some of the unfinished business of the TRC?
I think from the couple of months that I've been at the foundation, the most prominent thing for me that families are seeking is the truth. And not just the truth of what happened to their loved ones, but on a more sinister, potentially sinister level, is why the truth has been halted, or why has been delayed, or why it's been obstructed, why it's taken so long for so many people to get to the reasons as to why their loved ones disappeared or died. Why has it taken almost 3 decades for there to be any sort of truth-telling mechanism after the TRC? Because it was the beginning of the process, right? But it was never the end. it was the beginning of our storytelling as a country. And I think the failure to investigate and prosecute the cases that were handed over to the NPA has delayed a lot of the truth coming forward on multiple levels. And so I think these hearings are going to give us some insight into what happened, who was told what, why things happened, and hopefully for families to get more answers as to why their cases weren't investigated the way they should have been at the right time, where more people could have been criminally prosecuted because of age. You know, a lot of perpetrators have passed away now, and a lot of families have passed away. Parents have died not knowing what happened to their children. Siblings have died not knowing what happened to their brothers or sisters. And so it's a very difficult situation that we're hoping we can understand why we got to this place and how we got to this place and who's responsible.
So Sesetu, as a follow-up question then to our discussion, what are the gendered layers of memory that you are witnessing in the work that you're doing, especially when it comes to truth recovery?
Okay, a very loaded question, but very relevant for Women's Month. I think in my interactions with the families, I've found that a lot of the women, whether they be the wives of fallen activists or the children, become vessels of their male activist loved one's story, and put their own personal experiences to the side as a means to ensure that their loved one is remembered accurately and appropriately, and that the sacrifice is never forgotten. But it's interesting because a lot of women were also mobilizing and were activists in their own rights during the apartheid regime and were fighting against the system alongside their partners. But when their partners were the targets of executions, whereas they were the targets of midnight raids and psychological and emotional traumas, having to move around with their children a lot to keep them safe, or if they were arrested, being their roles as mothers or as keepers of their homes being used against them, to get information or to just psychologically torment them. But you see that the women in the families aren't willing to share, or rather aren't thinking to share their stories because they're still alive, right? And they feel like their role is to keep the memory of their loved one alive, sometimes to the expense or to the silencing of their own stories. But that's also my imposition on them, because sometimes people keep quiet as a means of protecting themselves. They're not re-traumatizing themselves and remembering those horrific memories. So you never know why people choose to not share their story, but I have seen that a lot of people become vessels for the male counterparts in the revolution and not really sharing their own contributions, their own sacrifices, and what it meant for them to carry on without the men in their lives, because that again is a display of strength and resilience, but it almost as if they had no choice, and so they don't think much of it.
Um, that's quite interesting because I just thought of something where would you recommend, would you recommend then that if we, I know we spoke about the hearings earlier, but if we set up a body where we acknowledge that gendered memory exists, we also acknowledge the constraints on faced by women when they are asked to share their experiences of the past. Do you think that we should have special hubs, I would call that, focused purely on just having women in the room, or just having a focus on women's experiences, sort of separating them from their male counterparts, just as a way of giving them the platform for their experiences to also be heard? Is that something, this is just a follow-up question, but is that something that you've seen or you've heard about?
That's an interesting question,
Mm.
and it also like reminds me of, how feminists had to organize to make this happen for the TRC. But this commission isn't about individual cases per se. It's about why a collective group of cases weren't followed through, why there weren't investigations, why there weren't prosecutions. So I think the gendered element becomes less relevant here because now we're looking at officials and actions and who delayed, who instructed, if they were no, they definitely were delays, but if they were explicit instructions to not prosecute or not go forward with a number of cases, why was that? And we see that that's like a systemic issue within the DOJ and the NPA versus the individual cases. So I don't know what a gendered lens would look like in this scenario. Perhaps if we were now post Commission of Inquiry and there's a revitalized and more intentional movement towards looking at these 300 plus cases, then perhaps then we could think of special hearings that really look at gender on a meaningful and comprehensive way. Yeah.